You've just entered the Disaster Tough podcast, the place for emergency managers, first responders, and humanitarians who want to get the job done. Stories, lessons, and tips are provided by field experts. This show is owned and operated by professional emergency managers at Doberman Emergency Management. We apply disaster tough logic by protecting life, property, and business continuity through planning, mitigation, and training. Check us out at DobermanEMG.com or click on the show notes. Radio comms just got a major breakthrough with the L3 Harris XL Extreme 400P. It's the newest and toughest radio out there. Built by their space and tactical teams, the XL Extreme series can take a beating. 1,700-degree blast of heat, repeated 3-meter drops, rain, salt water, you name it. The XL Extreme series by L3 Harris can take it. Visit L3Harris.com to schedule your demo today. The battle to monitor and contain COVID-19 just got exponentially better for us. We are officially introducing an electronic, reusable COVID-19 test through our sponsors. It's called the COVID Plus Test, created by Tiger Tech, distributed by FS Global. This is the first FDA-authorized, rapid, non-invasive pre-screener. It's extremely easy to use. Forget those one-time use swabs. This is a disaster-tough technology. For more information on the COVID Plus test, check out our show notes. Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I'm back with a frequent guest. I've never been able to say that until now. A frequent guest, Joe Hernandez. He's an urban search and rescue expert. I've been to his training. He's been out there at the Surfside Miami building collapse, the condo collapse. We introduced it a couple weeks ago. Right before Joe went out there, he actually spent several days on the site with a lot of people we both know. And he was actually on CNN for several days as a correspondent there. So he's providing some perspectives. Now that the response has been officially been called and we're moving into recovery, Joe is going to come back on here and he's going to be talking about some of those after actions that he observed when he was on site and to help better coordinate in the future, some of the wins that he saw and just kind of walk through the process. Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for having me and how everybody is doing well.
Yeah, I hope everybody's doing well too, especially the responders who are on the site. And you and I have talked a little bit about that. Hard to make the call that response needs to end, recovery needs to start. My perspective, and we were talking about this before, but once they dropped the building, it was like, okay, they're moving away. So can you walk us through that decision and what do you think about the decision and the timeliness of it?
I think the time factor, of course, being a realist, is right about that time. We were, going into the 13th day. And, the factors that were involved with the entire, from start of the disaster to basically making that decision, including, as you mentioned, bringing down the rest of the building that was left, occupying a good portion of the pile and leaving them unable to search that particular area. And again, creating a really unstable piece of it. But it was a decision by the folks that were there, the engineers, as well as the command, and supported by the mayor and financed through the governor and the state. And I think they made a good decision. And the dust impaction that creates, even though they did try to cover most of the pile, is significant. The shifting underground, et cetera. And so I'm okay with the decision that was made, as hard as it is for not only the victims' families, who you can't even imagine the feelings that they're going through, but the rescuer themselves, now changing their mindset to go from a rescue to a recovery.
Let's talk about the dust of dropping the other building. One, do you think it was necessary to drop the building when they dropped the building?
It was, if they wanted to continue them working in the area. If not, the closure would have been a lot harder. I believe that controlled bringing it down allows for another area to be searched for belongings and for closure, even though there will not be a DNA for human remains. There are items of belongings to those people, but it had to be done so that they can continue closure, even though recovery sounds gruesome at times. There still is the procedure of collecting tissue, bodies in the conditions that they are, and bringing closures to that family that there is an answer.
Yeah, I think you and I talked about this back in December, but just to re-bring it up because it's a question that's brought up frequently is like in large scale incidents like this, you find a limb, you find a toe, you find a thumb. At what point do you tell the family, hey, like you got to cut it off? That's kind of the worst terminology ever, but
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, hey, we found one body part. This is your closure. What happens in 4 months if you find a bone or find more DNA? Do you notify the family? Do you try to get them to not be notified? What do you think is the best course of action?
I think that, and I'll speak from a personal experience from a personal friend who, one of my sons, while he was in Afghanistan, close Gold Star mother, one of the platoon sergeants who stepped on an IED and, of course, tragically had his life. And 6 months later, they did recover his leg. And it was a question of back to the mother. Do we send this back to you? Do we exhume the body and add that to that? And there goes the mind. Did I even need to hear this type of information? Would it have been okay if I was never told the rest of that? Now hearing it from her firsthand, the emotional scar that rekindled, and was it really going to make any difference in her life and her family's life of finding part of Brian's body again? Did it really matter? And if she didn't hear that, would she have been okay with that news as well? And she said that she would have been okay if they would have just not mentioned it to her at that point in time, because it wasn't going to change anything.
Do you know if in Surfside they had the family sign a document saying if we find a body part that your window closes? You know that?
No, I do not know. I know that they were going through a multiple step confirmation on scene, and then send those remains again to a lab to confirm, and again take swabs to confirm that DNA. But not to my knowledge, would they again contact that family member if they were able to check them off the list? I'm assuming that there's so much going on that they probably wouldn't reach back out to that person to tell them that they found more. They would already assume that was a closure for them. Got it.
Yeah. So in terms of like the after action perspective, your personal preference, and it sounds like as a professional and also from the personal experience, that encouragement should stem from, hey, once we find some DNA, it's time to close the conversation, just to help people emotionally, that mental first aid. We've talked about that before, walk through that process. So, okay, so you were at Surfside for several days. You actually sent me several pictures of Walt that you saw Walt working on the pile. You saw some other people. I actually talked with Armando. He was out of town and when it happened, so he wasn't there initially. From an after action standpoint, coordination, collaboration, that kind of stuff, what did you observe? The good, the bad, the ugly. What can we improve in emergency management?
I think from start to finish, while I was there, they did a really good job. I believe that the incident commander, who was given that scene from Miami-Dade County Fire Rescue, it's a 2,500 member department, one of the largest in the entire East Coast, has plenty of depth within that agency and technical savvy within that agency. If you add to that all of the neighboring departments within South Florida, all a kind of dual-rolled, cross-trained fire rescue EMS fire-based system, he had everything that he needed in the Christmas tree, along with the city of Miami being the host agency for another federal task force. That made it 2 federal task force, each carrying $3 to $4 million worth of equipment that's federally owned and the state really was just waiting for the federal nod of a declared disaster for those assets to be used. And again, utilize all the members in a different role from a fire rescue and department base now to a deployment within a national response system deployment. And if you add the state teams that he had his hands available to, Florida having 8 total teams, 2 being federal and the other 6 being state assets as well. Maybe not as large as the 2 federal teams, and not as heavily equipped, but surely have the manpower, resources, knowledge, and trained side by side with those federal members, as you have well aware of. They do just as well of a job, just don't happen to be part of a federal system. And so he had enough manpower, he had enough equipment, he had enough savvy, and everything that goes along with it on that scene. And little people know that each team has, several structural engineers. The federal teams carry 2 structural engineers on each team. The states usually have 1. However, they doubled up on those structural engineers. The state itself sent structural engineers. And so there were at least close to probably 20 structural engineers over that time making decisions, whether they came from the FEMA office and or local engineers that wanted to lend a hand, with multiple deployment experience, all the way from the Oklahoma City bombing all the way up to now. So very well orchestrated, having close medical infrastructure still intact. It didn't affect any of the community. So it's one of those maybe easier scenes to control from an emergency management point of view, of saying it's kind of localized instead of spread across my entire city, and it's including even my health infrastructures that are there. University of Miami came through and just stocked all the physicians that really belonged to those teams, from a lot of those anyways, and they had everything that they need, canines as well. And I believe that he held on to his command as he should. There was no need for him to have a point of weakness. He was well educated, well trained, and had the resources at his hand, and he did a great job at it. Some of the other stuff, we can take a look at after actions, i.e. the booth setups, base of operations, where they set up the tents. Did it take a while for fences to get put up and keep people at bay, keep even the family members at bay, just because of how it pulls on everything, and make a corridor coming in and out? Not so much the responders who were looking for victims on that pile's job. As you know, it's more for that law enforcement and emergency management to make those decisions of, where are we going to pit these people, and how well can we make it accessible for them to get every day from where they're staying to the pile, from the pile back to where they're staying.
Well, you were talking about that for the Oklahoma City bombing. You guys call it like the Hyatt or something. It was a little box that was built. It was right next to the site. In terms of, you've already shared several times of like, hey, it's very important where you put up the shelter, or where you put up the facilities for the responders, and the direction it faces. In your opinion, was that followed this time, or was that a lesson learned this time?
Oh boy, here we go, 1995, and here we are, 2021, and you know what? The lessons didn't get learned very much. They still put the responders almost catty corner across the street in a large tennis complex, so it had an open area, hard ground, easy to set up, what we call Western shelters. However, it was within the distance of smell, sight, and sound of what they were doing the entire week. And so to me, it compounds, it goes from PTSD, you call it complex PTSD, is why add to the pile in somebody's emotional tank when there's no need to. It bothered me at that time. Some of the teams, of course, were put a little bit further down the street. I think it was a decision because of space in the area, because if there was space, I think they might have made the same mistake with the others. So they placed some of them further down, i.e. Walt's Task Force, Florida Task Force 4 was basically on the beach in a park. And the members woke up and got to watch the sunrise in the ocean. Respite, breath of fresh air, trauma timeout, as we call it. Huge. Working through that disaster, tough emotion of what's going on for them. And to see how much that decision wasn't correct, that to take the building down, they had to move the boom. They had to take both task forces, Florida Task Force 1 and Florida Task Force 2, and move them further down the street because they were going to get impacted by the dust as controlled as it was explained it was going to be.
Well, that's the problem with responders, like real talk. Like you're used to wanting to be either in scene or on scene and be close to the scene as possible just in case something happens. So like the idea of like a multi-day response, if you're not training for that, if you're not like thinking about that all the time, then it kind of changes the mindset, right? People are shocked when they hear that the National Strike Team, when they get deployed for emergency management, they're typically not in the disaster. We're at the Capitol. It's much better to coordinate with the governor's office at the Capitol than to be actually in the zone. But why would you want to be in the zone? It's starting to impact you. The idea of like the dust was impacting the responders is just like, man, that's 101. You said it, right? Sound,
Yeah.
Sound, sight, and smell. Those three things, those are your three factors of where you should put up shelters. And so that's a really good after action. Those people listening to the show, when they're doing their emergency plans for where they put up other responders, great call out for the logisticians setting that up. Yeah, I mean, that brings in so many thoughts in itself. Okay, so you talked about the federal response. Really interesting of the location, because if this happened in 90% of the country, there's not a federal team literally right there, let alone a huge department that, as you noted, tools, equipment, training, expertise, even to understand how to operate in a large, like a multi-agency or multi, like a large group function. Having 2,500 people in your department really helps understand scale. But in terms of the federal response, I was reading reports that, for lack of a better term, frustrated me on the timing of those responses. Not getting into details too much, but in terms of an after action of timing of state assets, federal assets, who's in charge, that kind of perspective, what do you think that we can learn in emergency management or a leadership capability? I keep calling it emergency management. What I'm talking about is leadership in emergency services, that strategic level. What do you think we can take away from this disaster that can be applied to any disaster in terms of time and coordination?
I think it would take instead of a reactive, possibly a proactive approach with emergency management, and i.e. The fire chief, police chief, city administration, and talk about those plans. Because depending on whose incident it is, i.e. in this fashion, it was that fire chief's throne, basically, and from there came out the decisions. And he held on to it pretty tight, i.e. if we go over to the shootings in Orlando, it becomes a law enforcement scene. And so you don't see the others in charge. They're basically part of that organization. So knowing what your capabilities are locally, and then within the state, I think is massive, being able to work those coordinations out. I know that the state teams, the incident was rolled upon as a state asset before the 11-hour mark of when it was declared a federal disaster by Washington. And so for those 11 hours, of course, it wasn't only going to be a local event, a local job, as we call it, within their agency, but they were going to reach out and use mutual aid agreements within the other jurisdictions, City of Miami, Hialeah, Coral Gables, Miami Beach, up all the way up into Broward County, Broward Sheriff's Office, and bring all of those resources in to help, and then reach out to the state. And the state began its mutual aid system, which we have, where they will now begin contacting the state teams and get the state same IST, IMT, incident management teams, incident support teams from within the state. And they were already beating feet on the ground before it was ever declared a presidential disaster. And so I really felt kind of blessed and lucky to know that our state had those capabilities and that it was able to be called upon that quickly. That was the best part. And and then everything else was just kind of in the weights, and was able to work out the kinks afterwards, even the political kinks.
The political kinks are always, in my perspective, usually the biggest kinks of every disaster. It's usually a holdup for lots of reasons, but they have the weight and they know it. I would say the most clever thing an emergency manager or a leader could do is to figure out the difference between law and rule, and to figure out what rules you can break and what laws you should never break.
Mm-hmm.
Because when it comes down to like saving lives and responding and getting the job done, you got to be able to be sometimes pretty tough, right? You have to have tough skin and be able to say like, no, we're just going to do it. But at the same time, if you're not clever in how you do that, if you're just bullheaded and you're dumb and you rub everybody the wrong way, they're not going to want to work with you, and you're going to slow down the response. So you have to be clever of figuring out, how do I be most effective and help without pissing everybody off?
That's right. Yeah, of course.
Kind of the name of the game, right?
Yeah. And that's not always going to happen. It's always going to make somebody angry within that game.
Yeah. And again, that's part of the game of like how far you can push somebody's button. But you also have to be able to roll with the punches. You know, people are going to do that to you. I've been in plenty of disasters where, you know, we get in a yelling match. I don't really yell at people, but a disagreement one way or the other. I felt like I was usually right. That's why I was arguing with my point. Other people view what they thought was right. A decision will be made, and you move on. You know, I've had great dinners and great conversations with those same people 2 hours later. And I think just like understanding that chess match, the chess match of a disaster, going back to that political point, is not only the responder standpoint of like, how do you deal with a rubble pile, but how do you deal with people? People are kind of your biggest issue, right?
Sure.
The people who want to get a picture, the people who are distraught about their family, of course, the politician who wants to look good or make their opponent look bad. You have to deal with like all those different things. And I think a lot of those things came out in Miami as well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So when you're walking away from this incident, outside of the shelters, what are your top 3 things that you think, okay, if we're going to have another building collapse, this is what we need to absolutely make sure we implement so we can find success based off of this event?
I would say not only preparing as they did for the rescuers and the responders, and possibly where they were going to stay, i.e. at Ground Zero, they were actually bussed in, and we got to stay a couple blocks away at the Javits Center. And so there you were removed every day and then came back to that area every day. So you had that break. Along with that is corridors, keeping the public away as far as you can. And that includes the coverage of the media, even though they are there for a good purpose at most of the time. And if you are going to allow them to be there, centrally locate them and prepare the area before you start allowing them to come into that particular area. At the same time, be there for they did a great job, I believe, in bringing those family members one time by bus. So there, the emergency manager is setting up parks and recreation, transportation, whatever bus system you do have in your community, whether they're small buses or large buses, and bringing those members over to the site and allowing them to be there one more evening and say a prayer for those family members that they possibly had lost in that pile. At the same time, capture what the rescuers are going through firsthand and watch. I believe that they did a great job in bringing that. And I think they also did a pretty good job from what I saw in individual decision makings. Not sure if it came from an EM side of the responders also going out and looking at the memorial that was being set up for those persons that were still missing. Whether that was an emotional trigger, it somehow gives them a sense of meeting that family member, meeting someone else, giving them a sense of purpose. And so it was good, I think, from both sides, what was done in that exchange of of persons.
It's an interesting point you're making in terms of, I mean, big picture. You're talking about big picture essentially, right there, right?
Yeah.
So I saw a report from, something that came out from the mayor about the frequency of contacting the families who were asking questions. In terms of staging, did you get to see an idea or how they were interacting with the families at all? Were they putting them in a facility nearby? How was that coordination piece happening between them?
To my understanding, they were in a facility close by. However, some of the family members just lived in the certain areas. I met a daughter of one of the women that was missing, who her and her husband lived in Jupiter, Florida. They both worked for Florida Power and Light, and I was able to speak a little bit with the husband and then with her later on. And so some of them traveled back and forth and just kind of wanted to be generally in the area. They weren't really a problem. They weren't really trying to approach the rescuers in any fashion. However, that's not always the issue. And so there still needs to be some type of a coordination effect to make sure that that doesn't go in a certain way. Emotions can run really deep in family members, and at times they could even become aggressive. We've seen that in calls and just in EMS and in ordinary situations, let alone knowing that your loved one is somewhere in a rubble pile and hasn't been found yet. So that needs to be strengthened up. And of course, the biggest scene was having a member of the city of fire department, a paramedic, a firefighter, well-trained, however, wasn't exactly rostered to be on the task force, however, met all the qualifications. And because his daughter, 7-year-old daughter, lived in that building with his ex, the task force felt it was extremely important for him to be part of the mission and be part of the search as well. Which, ironically, he was part of the team that found. Once they started finding the remains of what he was used to seeing in her apartment and in her living space, he knew that she was around
there. I have conflicted. Okay, first of all, that's heartbreaking. It's hard to talk about logistics when you hear a story like that. But in terms of the professional experience, I don't know how I feel about somebody looking for even a professional looking for their own family members. It is, in one sense, I won't say irony, but it is amazing that he was part of the team that found his own daughter, and kind of in a weird, twisted way, the piece that comes with that. I was part of the team that found my daughter.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the emotional impact, we talk about mental impact a lot. Potentially mistakes could have been made because he's working through a highly technical process of removing carefully, and to be able to keep his composure, and other people have to be aware of his. Did his team know that he was looking for his own child?
Just the task force. None of the other task forces knew. None of the other people knew. The media doesn't even know his name yet. And I understand the feelings and thoughts on the other side. However, because that's what he does for a living, and that's where he has been trained to do, to not let him at least have that opportunity to do that for his own daughter would have been him over the fence on the other side. And at the same time, we could say that his mind was in a different state maybe than the other rescuers, but at the same time, we could say maybe he was even more focused than everyone else because he had a mission that meant more to him than anyone else. And so he was a driving factor.
I don't want to imagine what that is like. I will say though that my now 2 weeks, because I've had basically 2 trainings, but basically my 1 week of training with you guys.
Yeah.
It wouldn't matter if I had no training. I don't know if I would be one of those people that everybody would need me to be to not be on that pile.
Sure.
I would do absolutely everything in my pile. I would probably break 30 laws trying to get onto that pile to look for my kids and my wife. So
Right.
I
Exactly.
understand that, especially with training. But like I said, it's a conflicted thought, because in medical, at the hospital, you can't work on a family member for that reason.
Correct.
You don't want to make mistakes, but
never say never. I in my career, early in my career, I was on a unit with two other individuals who rode three in a truck. What some people call an ambulance, we call a rescue truck. 3 paramedics, and in the back of the truck, we go to call that cardiac arrest. The lieutenant makes a decision and tells a friend of mine that was there, not to mention his name, that it was okay, that he got permission from the hospital to call the code, and he didn't stop. He continued on. I was driving the rig, and we were almost arriving at the hospital. He kind of repeated it to him. Did you not hear that we could call this code? He goes, yeah, but this is my dad. Changed a couple things inside that truck and on that day. So understand totally, things are always so ironic. Sometimes we just don't understand why. You know what the BDU jacket looks like, the coverall that they're wearing in those rubble piles to keep themselves protected, almost just like an army jacket that they wear, a soldier wears. And you were around that scenario that we call the daycare and the bus. And so you could imagine that 7-year-old, then you taking off your jacket and draping it over that child or your own child. Leaves you without words for a little while.
Yeah, man, I talk about lack of words. In our line of work, we deal with death, and some emergency managers, luckily enough, but some emergency managers had to deal with response. And the way the world's going, they're going to be dealing with a lot more response. And those who are on a response and coordinating directly with USAR make the decisions for life and death. Where do you send resources, knowing the other people are going to be impacted? Kind of like a call on ending response, knowing you're essentially changing your tempo. You're calling it. Because of that, because I've dealt with a lot of death in the field, it usually doesn't impact me, because I feel like I've been desensitized a little bit to it. But for whatever reason, when you texted me that, because I found out from you, 12 hours before the news broke, and I was distraught. I ended up calling a good friend of mine, Patrick. And I was just like, I don't know. I go weirdly, not weirdly. It wasn't even so much that he was like, oh, it's because you're a dad. I was like, I don't think that's it. I think lately I've been so focused on learning how much sacrifice a first responder has to give. A lot of the first responders in 9/11 have cancer. That's still a possibility for you, and that scares me. But like when you see a rubble pile like that, you know that they're putting themselves in harm's way. They're sacrificing time from the family. They could get cancer. There's widow makers hanging from there. They're putting their lives at risk, and they already are sacrificing so much. And then you have to get your own kid out of the pile, and then later on bury your child. It's beyond not fair. Seems wrong.
Yeah.
The one solace that I get from all of that is that, in terms of an eternal perspective, life is a blip of a moment. Eternal. I believe in the eternal perspective, and so the idea of that you're happy for billions and billions of years. Okay, you have a horrible moment for like a blip on that radar, then that makes up for it. I'm also grateful for, everybody always talks about mercy. We're grateful for mercy. I'm also grateful for justice, because that's not just. And basically a man-caused, whether it's intentional or not, a man-made incident has
Sure.
I don't know what I'm trying to say. It sucks.
Absolutely. And absolutely being grateful for that eternal clock that we all get to focus on and enjoy if that's where that what we believe in. And I truly believe in that same way too. And it kind of strengthens, everybody has a place to pull their strength from. And I tend to be strengthened by that as well. And the family backs that up 100%. And so that kind of is my drive and your drive to continue forward and doing what we're doing and teaching that next generation and able to teach, deliver this information to those that will be responding in the years to come. Who would have thought at all, John, that May 24th to 28th, we were doing a FEMA urban search and rescue medical team specialist class, and a dozen of those individuals would be putting their skills to practice in a disaster that had over 159 people missing.
I told Walt, I told you, I said this multiple times, Disaster Medical Solutions, your company has the best training I've ever seen. And the instructors, everyone was top notch. And I said that a couple of weeks before the disaster. I am so grateful. I mean, I already had a ton of respect for search and rescue, obviously. But I'm so grateful to know that the half a dozen people who are on that pile happened to go through the best training in the country weeks prior. That's the mercy side. The justice part is that I'm beyond belief at this point. There is a God in heaven, and there is an eternal perspective, and there are ways to figure that out if you have to put in the work, and that's a whole other thing outside of emergency management. But the mercy part is that people went to the best training in the country weeks prior. And the mercy part is that these people, men and women, are sacrificing, are willing to sacrifice that much. And the mercy part is to allow a father to go look for his daughter. That's mercy. Justice might say, hey, probably shouldn't be on the pile. But I can't imagine robbing somebody of that, especially if they're trained.
Sure.
As your point. So I mean, that's a great call out. You and I always do this on each of our shows. We start talking about the details, and then we get the heartstrings part starts coming out a little bit. But I think it's because you and I have you way more than me, but been around the block a few times and know what it's like. We feel for the survivor, we feel for the responder. What we want to do on shows where you come on, especially because you're a tactician, is to be able to help out from the strategic level to make sure the tactics run more smoothly. And so what we've been calling out today are things like, hey, where do you put your temporary housing? Smell, sound, sight. Those three things be aware of when you're putting people up. Things like their surviving family members. How do you give them closure? That's something really important. When do you call response versus recovery? The kinks of the political perspective. In terms of like an initial after action based off of your perspective, you've already highlighted so many things that if I was in Hoboken, Wisconsin, or if I was in Columbus, Ohio, or Sacramento, California, or Miami, Florida, those things apply everywhere.
Sure.
And so I really appreciate you coming onto the show and sharing that. We always do this. We gotta like, next time you come on the show, it has to be like, we have to end it on a positive note, because this is like breaking my heart right now. So
absolutely. There will be good times for that too, when we can really encourage everyone to focus on some good things and keep their mindset. And unfortunately, this was, we went through the July 4th holiday as a different event this time around. And then here, ironically, on this side of the coast, where I've retired to from the East Coast to the West Coast, I had to prepare for Hurricane Elsa.
We didn't even talk about that. Like the rain was impacting. This just sounds miserable. That's the problem with disaster services. Is like, oh man, it becomes kind of doomsday preppy when you think about like, oh man, we didn't even talk about that in terms of the after action, the actual weather impacting a building collapse.
Yeah.
Basically it turns all the dust and debris into like mud and concrete, right?
Yeah, almost like building a sandcastle and taking that bucket of water to create the walls.
Good gosh.
Yeah, it's just you're making just a solid mud pie almost. It's incredible. And then the irony, as we just kind of mentioned here, these guys are the ones returning to North Florida, the Panhandle team, the Jacksonville, the Orlando and Tampa team, and saying, "Are you kidding me? Now I got to go home and board up my windows. I got to cut my grass if I even can make it before the rains come, and I got to pick up everything around the yard because it might be a direct hit up in North Florida." So,
here's a question for you: are there groups out there that take care of the families of the firefighters after they deploy?
I'm glad you asked that. The answer is yes and no. And so, as an emergency manager from that community, i.e., you are the emergency manager for Pinellas County and the Clearwater area, Tampa area, Hillsborough County, and you know that your teams are over there. You've got 80 responders over there. And if the fire department or the union of the fire department or the benevolent of the fire department doesn't do something, it sure would behoove those emergency managers to stir up that pot and say, how can we help get someone out there to go take care of these loose ends while these members are on a deployment for the last 10 to 14 days? Because we know it is an incredible situation. You should bring my wife on and call the show Wives of USAR, because if anything could go wrong when you're on deployment, it goes wrong. The refrigerator breaks down, the car doesn't work anymore, a kid gets taken out of school, someone's sick. You'd almost need powers of attorney for them to fill out the paperwork and pay bills while you're gone. And you need someone there. It's crazy on either if it's a man or a woman deployed. It just throws everything in a kink. And then on the funny part is when you come back home 10 to 14 days later and someone else has been in charge, you try taking the helms again.
Oh, I know. Sometimes they want you to. That's a hilarious thing. Hey, you just got back. Hey, welcome back. You're putting you to work. You're like, you don't know what I just went through. I will say this on the FEMA side. I'm going to call out FEMA here real quick. They don't do that. I deployed for months at a time. I deployed for months at a time with a 2-hour notice, not knowing when I was going to come home. Absolutely. No support. You're talking about people, everything that could go wrong. My freaking wife, I'm in a tornado response and tornado and flooding response in Georgia. My wife, who is young, healthy, beautiful, the whole deal, she texts me and says, "Hey, I got shingles." And I'm like, "What? How did you get shingles?" So it's now I'm worried about her and how she's doing. She had just started a new job right when that happened. So it's and then you're gone for months without notice. Yeah. And of course you don't, we have this rule on social media. I never tell people when I'm deployed or not, because my wife's at home alone and now, with kids. So maybe you and I can collaborate on some ideas on, even your wife, Wives of USAR. You should start a podcast. But thinking of resources for people who support the responders. My wife is kind of our family emergency manager for when I'm deployed, right? She has to make those coordination calls, right?
Sure.
So, she's my incident commander at all times.
Absolutely. Agreed 100%. I've got one of those too, and I rely heavily on it. And now trying to carry that load too while I'm here, and she's taking care of our daughter really presents an incredible load. But I love the way that you're thinking. I do agree 100% that FEMA does not fulfill that role. I know that on my personal department, it was fulfilled to a certain degree by our benevolent. And so the guys would take turns and come out. One of them even said, "Dude, I'm dizzy going around all the trees you got. Can you cut some trees for the next time?" And at the same time, for some reason, hurricanes changes directions and our home got impacted. And so our city task force sent units up to take care of check on the welfare of our houses and our spouses and make sure if they needed a roof put back on, because the hurricane actually impacted those homes as well. And it was a welcome relief to those individuals.
I think that's kind of the mic drop moment. And I just want to thank you again, Joe, for coming on the show.
Yeah.
For talking to me about the after action of response of the Surfside a Miami condo collapse, and walking us through your own personal experiences. I know because you've had so much personal experience, it's really hard for you to be out there. And so just want to say, again, we're thankful for everything you've done. On a very positive note, Disaster Medical Solutions, big fan of your organization. Thank you again for inviting me out to that USAR training, because I got to understand perspective before this building collapsed. And I know you're doing another training on November 30th through December 3rd. I'm promoting your company. I should start getting paid for it. But no, but seriously, like if you're a firefighter, you're listening to the show right now, or you're a paramedic and you want to get more USAR training, there is a FEMA course that Joe puts on him and his company. Again, just the best in the country. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's a medical perspective, and they go all out. You really get to walk out of there as a true expert, and we're grateful that those people were on the rubble pile. I'm glad that they were trained by you. So Disaster Medical Solutions, again, November 30th through December 3rd, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Have a great week.